Yes, I believe that's solved now.
Okay, great. So I'll mute myself as soon as all of the speeches start. Okay, so then any other issues, or apart from the beeping, was that it? Okay, so it seems to have been it. Then I would like to welcome all of you for the first round of online WSDC 2020. Even though we can't see each other in person, this is still... Welcome the first speaker of Team Propuesta of Team Denmark to give their speech. And yes, the floor is yours.
The global war on drugs, which has been waged for more than 4 decades, has incarcerated millions of people, empowered gangs and cartels, and culminated in the worst opioid crisis in modern history. On Proposition, we choose to see addicts as the victims that they are. We're so incredibly proud to propose. I'll be doing a few things in my speech today. First, our model, then our first constructive point about benefits for victims of drug addiction, and then secondly, I want to talk about protecting communities. But first, our model. There are 5 parts here. 1, we would set this in all countries. 2, these zones will be away from primarily residential areas that have mostly family homes, schools, or playgrounds, and they would exist in non-residential areas that in the status quo already have high rates of illegal drug use and drug trade. They would be closed off, have controlled entry and access, and furthermore, entry to these zones would only be permitted for those at the age of majority. 3, while in these areas, the use and sale of all drugs will be legal, but unrelated crimes such as assault, trafficking, etc. will still be prosecuted. Importantly, while a known drug dealer or user wouldn't be arrested for entering these zones, those who are wanted or suspected of other serious crimes, such as murder or being part of gangs, can still be targeted. 4th, then, these zones will also contain significant harm reduction tools to protect the safety of those who use and those who deal. This can look like free and clean needle exchanges, easily accessible drug testing kits to ensure the safety and purity of drugs, and nearby medical staff in case of overdose, as well as counselling and rehab options for those who feel they are ready to change their lives. 5, we know that countries have very different laws regarding the sale and use of drugs. Therefore, we think that outside of these zones, we oppose a strong-handed war on drugs approach and support more liberal drug laws. However, we will also defend these zones in countries that have stricter laws outside of these areas. With that said, moving into my first constructive point, I want to talk about benefits for victims of drug addiction. The thesis here is that drug users and dealers will engage in this trade on both sides of the house, but on Proposition, we guarantee a safe environment and minimize harms to addicts. Before I go into this point, I want to establish that irrespective of government policy or whatever stance or position gives you, there are structural factors at play that force both drug addicts and drug dealers to continue to buy and sell narcotics. First, drug addiction, rather than a character flaw, is a disease that afflicts millions. Through no fault of their own, many were tricked by greedy pharmaceutical companies, pushed into it by their family or friends, or became addicted in a desperate attempt to cope with pain or mental illness. This is why in countries like Iran, where there are severe and often lethal punishments for drug use, we still see an epidemic of addiction to opium and synthetic marijuana. And even in countries like Australia, with liberal and progressive drug laws, we continue to see an epidemic of drug use. These structural factors will exist on both sides of the house and will all but continue guaranteed drug use. Second, most drug dealers are similarly coerced into their acts by poverty, by a lack of opportunity, and by the failure of the state to provide them with jobs or an education. This is why, regardless of how severe the punishment, dealers will continue to deal drugs to claw their way out of poverty. Having said this, why does this mean the state must establish these free zones for drug use and sale? In principle, when the state continues to be complicit in creating those conditions that promote the abuse of drugs and are neglectful in alleviating the poverty and suffering that forces desperate people into selling drugs, it is illegitimate for it to punish the citizens for these crimes. This is particularly important because in the status quo, the application of these drug laws are unjust and disproportionately impact poor and minority communities. So white people in countries like the United States use drugs more often than black people, but black people are arrested and charged at 5 times the rate. And importantly, for the most privileged communities, this motion is already a reality. On the glitzy upper floors of a New York skyscraper, investment bankers already buy and sell drugs without fear of consequences. The children of those bankers at elite American universities already effectively live in these zones, buying and selling with impunity. We have a principled obligation to give the most vulnerable who are pushed into desperation by state inaction the same privilege we already extend to the rich, to the powerful. Second, beyond being principally obligated to provide these zones, on proposition, we also more meaningfully protect and save the lives of drug users. The benefits to victims of drug addiction then are twofold. Firstly, we tell you that users will likely continue to abuse on both sides. On opposition, however, for fear of having their drugs taken away, for fear of being arrested and jailed, I'll take you in a minute, many users resort to bathrooms, to back alleys. This leaves them particularly vulnerable, without help like naloxone in case of overdose, without clean needles to avoid spreading diseases like HIV, and unable to test their drugs for toxins like fentanyl, and without access to counselling to help individuals make informed choices or provide help for those seeking to end their addiction. These are all things that we provide on our side through these designated drug zones that are able to provide targeted outreach to abusers. Before I move into the second part of this point, yes, I'll take you PY.
Why the drug users in your non-residential areas will go and undergo the treatment that is provided there.
Okay, so we think there are like a myriad of reasons why people are actually like going to go to these areas. Mia will expand more on this in her point, but we think that actually just the fact that these places are legal is a really, really big incentive for people to go there, since they won't be like arrested. Second of all, we think that drug users are actually really interested in their own safety. So like given the choice between like reusing needles which may give them HIV or having free access to clean needles, they will choose the safer option. But secondly, we also protect users by removing the risk and vulnerability of being a customer on the black market. So we tell you that vulnerable communities like women, like gender minorities face disproportionate rates of violence and sexual assault when trying to purchase these drugs, with dealers often extorting or physically harming them. Decriminalization often necessitates that these sales occur in dark or isolated areas where these vulnerable groups can be attacked without witnesses, and the fear of stigma or jail time discourages many victims from going to the police. These groups will buy drugs on both sides of the house, but on prop, we let them do it safely. With that said, moving to my second constructive point, I want to talk a bit about protecting communities. The thesis of this point is that in the status quo, the drug trade harms vulnerable communities. And I'm going to prove that on prop, we're instead containing the spread of drugs and protecting these vulnerable communities. Let's begin with setting some important context. We tell that most of the poorest and most vulnerable communities in the status quo already face rampant rates of drug abuse and the social costs that accompany it. So this looks like neighborhoods such as Vancouver's downtown east side, which is both the poorest postal code in North America and the epicenter of the opioid epidemic. Importantly, however, in the status quo, the harms of this drug use spills over into local communities, into schools, into neighborhoods. When users are slumped outside your apartment building when you leave for kindergarten in the morning and the local park is littered with needles, it makes it harder and more dangerous for local small businesses to prosper, for children to walk to school, and for families to feel safe. We change this on prop. First, when drug trade is confined to a supervised and clearly marked area, it no longer pervades every nook, every cranny of already vulnerable communities because users concentrate in a protected and secure area. So after a drug consumption room was opened in Barcelona, the number of stray syringes found on the streets fell from 13,000 to just 3,000 per month. Secondly, it is only when drug use is contained and these communities deemed safe that they are likely to attract investments, customers to small businesses, and other opportunities. This current lack of investment is a massive harm in opposition because it is this lack of investment that caused the very economic decrepitude from which drug trade was born. A dark and violent spiral of poverty is perpetuated under the opposition. On prop, we contain drug trade and allow for improved development in the surrounding community. We're proud to stand for safety. We're proud to stand for justice. We're so incredibly proud to propose.
Thank you for your speech. When the other judges are ready to continue, please give me a thumbs up so I can know when we can continue. Okay, so thanks a lot for your speech. And also I forgot to ask in the beginning for the next, or for the speaker for that preference, how to indicate points of information. So for the next speaker, please, before you start, you could say either if you would like to have the other speakers unmute themselves or hold up a piece of paper where it says POI. Okay, thanks. So now please welcome the first speaker of Team Opposition to open their case.
Okay, so just to test audibility, is this okay? Okay, yeah, so we would, like, the entire team would like to have POIs, set, like, to vocal way, so we're okay with being interrupted. And we apologize if we have interrupted anyone before. Okay, so 3, 2, 1. We think that harm reduction is an honorable approach. However, we want to adopt it as well. But where side proposition actively encourages and supports drug use, we want to help people on the path of recovery, and that is the main difference. 3 things in my speech. First, our stance. Second, rebuttals. And third, our own argument about why proposition scales up drug use. 3 points under our stance. First, we want to adopt locally based initiatives, such as like NGOs reaching out to like local drug groups and offering them like peer-to-peer and a peer-to-peer approach, offering them clean syringes, or for example, also drug testing kits, but also recommending them specific treatment facilities, right? Secondly, how do we want these treatment facilities to look? We're talking about like examples from specific parts of England or where it is right now being implemented in Germany, which means that we want like psychological counseling. We want, we want to give them methadone, or we want to even give them job training to help them reintegrate back into the society. And thirdly, and lastly, we want to take a new police approach called cautioning, which essentially means that when someone is caught with drugs, they will not be sent to jail, but rather there will be recommended ways in which they can seek help, such as our treatment centers. Now to our rebuttal. When we talk about their stance, we must notice one thing. And that is that they say that they will preclude drugs or like gangs from entering these areas, but they want to make these areas all around the world, right? So when we're talking about countries such as Colombia, such as Uruguay, or such as certain specific parts of Mexico, right, where gang violence is rampant, and when cartels are shooting each other to fight over the drug market, we think that they will get much more violent when side proposition wants to take this drug market away from them. Now we have 2 responses to their first argument about victims, right? The first thing is that if you guys already prevent people with a criminal record going there, and you say that Black people are already like oppressed in the status quo and already have a criminal record because of like unfair police oppression, you are still ostracizing Black people from reaching these centers, right? But secondly, we give you several reasons as to why the most vulnerable people will not access your area. The first one concerns policing. Because if you want to check people's age, which you said you want to, and if you want police to be there to prevent crime, most drug addicts won't go there because they generally distrust the state and they distrust the police, right? Secondly, we talk about established communities in the status quo where drug users already know where to find drugs, which means they do not necessarily have an incentive to go to these areas. Thirdly, we say that dealers in these established communities don't want their consumers to go to these areas, therefore they will be likely to manipulate or coerce them to stay just right where they are. But fourthly, we are talking about extreme drug addicts who don't care where they will take the drug, but only when, right? Because when you are under like severe heroin withdrawal, you want to take your shot as soon as possible, and you won't necessarily go to these areas. But lastly, we talk about proximity, because their model is unfeasible. We want to ask them where you will put these areas in cities like New York, right? Maybe Central Park, sure. Where will you put them in Tokyo, guys? Like, please answer this, because we think these areas will not be accessible to the vast majority of people. Now, note, and now this is very important, because insofar as proposition doesn't help the people that are the most vulnerable, their arguments are largely not real, right? Because we hardly mitigate them. But this is also different under our side, because we take a localized NGO approach where we reach out to these people directly, where we do not discourage them through policing, which is something they said in their model. 2 quick responses to their second argument. Firstly, we say that like you're making it easier to get drugs out in these specific communities when you are like creating epicenters where they are legal. We say that you will easily get them out of there, right? But secondly, when you have a poor community, we think the locals will be like pretty angry if instead of investing into like their underinvested schools, you rather invest to help like drug addicts that people already see as someone that is like, leeching from the state and someone that is quite problematic. Now moving on to my first argument as why side proposition, I'll take you in a second, scales up the drug use. But go.
Please engage with our analysis where we told you that the drug use that is rampant in these communities is actually what's holding back investment, actually what is stopping them from investing and making their community better.
We say that like on average, the political backlash that will be generated from the locals will like discourage any like long-term investments into your area. So we don't think that they are sustainable because of that, right? Choose like a better model such as ours. Okay, to our own argument, we bring you 4 points about scaling drug use. The first one concerns eliminating risk factors. 2 examples here. The first one concerns legality. Because note that in the status quo, a lot of people want to try drugs just because they're interested, because they want to cope with anxiety or depression, or because their loved one has left them or their family member has died. They're usually discouraged because they don't want to have a criminal record. They don't want to face any risk of being caught by the police, but Proposition eliminates that. But the second example here concerns access, because most people in the status quo have literally no idea where they should get heroin or cocaine, but Proposition tells them, hey guys, it's right here. The second point here concerns the communities that will start to form within those drug-like areas, right? Because we acknowledge that some individuals might flock there, such as like teenagers or such as like adolescents wanting to experiment, or people that are not necessarily part of a drug community in the status quo. They will start to form communities, and this is problematic because firstly, they are then more likely to leave their past communities behind, right? You can leave your family and your past friends behind when you have found a new community into which you can integrate and which tolerates your drug use. No, thank you. Secondly, you are not likely to leave the community and actually go for treatment because you know that you would lose them and you know that doing drugs is what binds you the most. So people under their side are less likely to seek treatment, right? But thirdly, the people within these groups are likely to reinforce each other's behavior, right? So you might go from cocaine to heroin, or you might go from smoking heroin to injecting it because that is a behavior that will be reinforced within that specific group. Note that type proposition, therefore, not only increases the drug use, but also scales it up as people are more likely to try more intense drugs. The third point under this argument concerns prescription medication, right? And this is something that they talked about as well. In the United States, 9.9 million people have misused opioid prescription medication in 2018. And note that when your prescription runs out, you want a quick fix, right? You want to take something again to ease, to ease this. And this is important because in the status quo, 5% of people who misuse this medication end up being addicted to heroin. 5%, right? Proposition, when they tell that, hey guys, you can go here and take some more, right?
Sir.
They'll actively, no thank you, encouraging them to fulfill their needs, right? So Proposition might increase this number from 5% to 8%, which might sound like a small incremental change, but we're talking about the lives of hundreds of thousands of people here. But the last and the fourth point in this model concerns the specific drug dealers that will be within these non-residential areas. Because what they want is the highest amount of people to take drugs. So they're likely to approach anyone who comes there and offer them drugs because that generates them revenue, right? But secondly, they want people to take harder drugs. Because the harder are the drugs that you use, the more likely you are to become a regular customer, and the less elastic is the price of these drugs, which means that they can increase the price over the long run. This gives a structural incentive to drug dealers within these areas to get as many people on drugs, but to also force them to try harder and harder drugs. At the end of the day, side proposition only makes more people take drugs, and those that are already taking them will only be taking the ones that are harder. That is why you vote opposition.
Okay, thank you for your speech. The other judges, are you ready? Okay, perfect. Then please welcome the second speaker of Team Proposition to continue their case.
Drugs are a force that kills in more ways than one. They rob the lives of addicts, they drain the lives out of neighborhoods, and they snuff out the lives of children caught up in gang violence, turf wars, and crossfires. Today, 205 Americans will die of a drug overdose, but that is just the tip of a treacherous iceberg. Only through removing the main income revenue of gangs to remove the overhanging threat of murder and of violence that cripples communities under their side. I'm so proud to propose. Before we send our third and final substantive argument on reducing gang violence and crime, some rebuttal on what we heard coming out of first op. And here I'd first like to deal with the model picks that they told us in response. The first thing they told us was that people are unlikely to enter these areas. And I think Anna already gave you some of this analysis in her first speech, but we told you that there are structural reasons and structural incentives as to why people and users are likely to want to go to these areas. We told you, first of all, that it's a huge incentive that people will not get arrested when they go to these areas. We told you, secondly, that there's going to be much safer conditions to actually get your drugs in. We told you that even for an addict, the value of a medical staff and the comfort of having test kits to check your drugs should not be underestimated. And thirdly, we want to say that the fact that you can come here and probably engage with drug dealers without getting caught up in other forms of criminal activity, which I'll get more into in my third argument, is a pretty huge incentive in and of itself. They then told us that drug addicts won't think about all of these benefits because they just want the closest option and this is going to be far away. Well, I don't think that characterization was fair on this point, because I think it's actually pretty likely, and we told you already this in our model, that we're going to put these designated areas in close proximity to the areas that already have high abuses of drugs. We think even in cities like New York or Tokyo, we're able to find parks, so we're able to find part of an empty building that we're able to set up these areas in. But thirdly, I think this is just largely uncomparative, because even if all recruiters are going to go to these areas, the fact that just some or just a few of the people will go to these areas is enough of a benefit for us to win this debate. But they again told us in their own stance that they're going to support local initiatives and like treatment facilities on their side. Well, first of all, I think they here already agree that they see addicts as the victims that we characterized in our first speech. We think that largely conceded to some of our case. But secondly, they gave us no mechanisms as to why people were likely to go to these places. I think it's much more likely that people who will use the medical facilities on outside of the house when they anyways can go to that place to also buy the drugs and to also not get arrested. That is much more of an incentive. But they then told us about how much more drug abuse on outside of the house, we're going to have much more drug addicts. Well, a couple of responses here. First of all, I don't think the reason why they told us here that it's because we're removing deterrence and we're making it more accessible. Well, I don't think the reason why people don't do drugs in the status quo, why most people don't do drugs, has anything to do with neither accessibility nor legality. We think the reason people don't do drugs is because people are aware that it's dangerous, and we think that won't change on either side of the house. But we also want to say that the small minority who do drugs will do it on both sides of the house. The reason that they are addicted is because of structural reasons that have coerced or forced them into an addiction. We told you this is because people have been tricked by pharmaceutical companies. People are using drugs as a means to cope with mental illness because the state provides them with no other help in this regard, or because people have been pushed by friends or family into this addiction. Also, I want to say that insofar as their model was practically decriminalization of drugs in and of themselves, then we don't see how this is any different on their side of the house. Insofar as drug addicts exist to the same degree on either side of the house, this debate is then about how we can make these drug addicts inject their drugs in the most safe way. But that told us about how on our side of the house, people are also going to be caught up in bad communities because they're going to gather together in these places and use even harder drugs. Well, I think in the status quo, there already exist communities of drug addicts because they're likely to find each other even on the street. But I also think that them gathering in these communities of safe injection sites is actually likely to make these communities better. It's likely to make these areas more healthy. I think this was pretty much contradictory of their own analysis, because if they on one hand don't want people to go, say that people won't go to the places, they can at the same time say that we're creating communities by people going there. But the last thing I just want to deal with before my argument is that they told us that people in these communities are going to be angry that the government prioritizes to spend money on these areas. Well, I think this was a mischaracterization of communities as well. Because I think the reason that people have resentment towards drug addicts in the status quo is because of the fear of having their children walk home from school, seeing drug addicts on their way, walking on needles, stepping on needles. We're the side that deals with exactly these problems when we're able to remove the drug addicts and put them in one space specifically that can be away from schools, away from kindergartens. And this is the point at which we're going to see more investments into these communities as well. Before going into my third argument, I'll take that POI.
Right. So let's say that everything that you're saying is true and that most people will go into these areas. You will put away criminals and create new gangs of exclusively criminals that will terrorize the local community.
I think this is actually responded to in my third argument, which is exactly about why in our side of the house we're much more likely to reduce gang violence and crime. So the thesis here is that the most pernicious and violent drug dealers get pushed out of the system when the majority of drug trade happens under controlled legal conditions. We don't think that all drug dealers are equally harmful or dangerous. There are two general categories I want to identify. Firstly, some drug dealers are largely non-dangerous figures that are primarily engaged in dealing drugs and not entangled in organizations like gangs, mafia, or other organized crime. These would be dealers who deal out of necessity for money or simply because they've afforded no other opportunities in life. There's a second and far more pernicious type of dangerous drug dealers as well. These are the ones that are affiliated with gangs and cartels and who are responsible for the vast majority of the harm related to the drug trade. These dealers often push out their more benign competition using violence, threats, and turf wars that wipe out rival sellers, allowing them to dominate the market and extort vulnerable users. On our side, we push out these dangerous dealers. Firstly, because those who are wanted for serious violent crimes will still be subject to prosecution. Areas hold their social workers and security to a great extent deter gangs rate for this reason. Furthermore, the presence of these regulated areas strips gangs of their traditional means of undermining competition, such as threats or violence when dealing in their territory. This would allow those more benign dealers that I described above to thrive and steal market share from organized crime. This is especially true since the average user who likely wants to avoid violence and danger would prefer to interact with a safe dealer inside the zone as opposed to a violent one outside of it. A couple of important impacts. Firstly, I think that means that buyers are no longer reliant on dangerous drug dealers. Vulnerable addicts are safer and the violent drug dealers have less power to abuse. But second, on our side, we also take money out of the hands of gangs. Illegal drug trade is a core revenue stream for other illegal activities such as gang warfare or sex trafficking. When gangs are depleted of their main income source, these activities are also reduced in extension. The second part of this argument is that we reduce deadly trade force on our side of the house. In the status quo, rival gangs fight over territory and customers. When drugs are illegal, there exists an incentive to dominate a limited market using any means possible, and this has led to one, unsafe communities that are rife with theft, vandalism, and other crime linked to gang presence, and two, harms to citizens which sometimes even leads to deaths. In Chicago, for instance, at least 175 kids under the age of 17 have been killed within the past 3 years due to being caught in gang crossfires. Gangs also often terrorize and threaten families who live on profitable street corners and coerce children in those neighborhoods into working for them. On our side, we actively disempower the most violent drug dealers and weaken gangs by disincentivizing them from operating in state-regulated safe zones so proud to propose.
Right, am I audible? Excuse me, is that a yes? Okay, sorry. All right, may I start? Ladies and gentlemen, the best piece of side proposition in this debate is to conserve the status quo and make it a tiny bit less dangerous. We believe that they offer you a world without hope of recovery. They offer you a world in which there will be more drug users and in which the most vulnerable drug users will be ignored. Before I get to the core questions of this debate, let me rebut the split that we just heard from the second proposition speaker. They talk about gang violence and how all out of a sudden these gangs would just peacefully go away. No, we tell you that they mischaracterize how these gangs work. Like if they already shoot up the state and are in some countries in direct war with it, we believe that they will continue with war, but only with state. Even more so on their side of the house because the state is actively taking market away from them. Therefore, they have to fight between each other and between the state for the remains of this market. We believe that that sufficiently deals with that argument. Therefore, let me get to one of the three key questions that I'm going to address in my speech, and that is why the treatment centers on our side of the house are a lot more efficient than those that you can find in proposition. Why is that? We can do that. First of all, it is the simple fact of location. Because our centers are not located in the park, this means the drug addicts struggling to struggling to battle with the addiction are not exposed to the constant temptation of the drug. They do not see it constantly around themselves. Therefore, the risk of them relapsing is a lot lower on our side of the house. Secondly, we believe that what Proposition does is that they put like the social groups of these addicts right at the doors of these treatment centers. This means that if I, as a drug addict, am deciding whether I will continue with this treatment program, I am a lot less likely to do so on the Proposition side of the house, because these social groups that are right by the doorstep are offering me an easy way out of the guilt and a temptation to cede my treatment. Second reason that we believe here is simply monetary one, because we believe that Proposition is wasting a lot of money for what is already a tight budget on unnecessary things that do not directly relate to treatment itself. What do they have to spend that money on? They have to build these new buildings. They have to buy the land on which these areas would be built. They have to make sure that all the policing is done efficiently. They provide a very complicated model that will cost a lot of money. We tell you that already a unique benefit that you can get on Opposition is that we can take all of that money and put it directly to targeted treatment in treatment centers and to improving their quality. Why is improvement of quality of treatment centers so important? Because we believe that if you don't want to do treatment centers right, and if you don't give them enough money, they will have very little to zero effect. Like, the problem in status quo is that the treatment centers that we already have are severely underfunded. This means that they cannot train proper professionals. Therefore, the statistics show us that 50% of drug addicts that go into treatment centers in many countries around Europe do not come to a second treatment. We believe that that is because they do not have enough trust in the professionality of the institutions, which is crucial, because we believe that these institutions have the unique ability to take them out of their bad habits and show them a way to recovery. Why is that? Because they can provide psychological help on our side of the house. You need trained professionals which will help you with your mental issues that you oftentimes have and show you how to reintegrate back into the society. It is secondly that on our side of the house we provide you, for example, methadone individualized medical programs which can help you take away the craving for the drug without giving you the high. This enables you crucially to, for example, enter job training programs which can then help you find another job. We help these people find friends, find jobs, and reconnect back with their family. This is crucial in this debate, because what Proposition does is that they love these people in the communities which have been dragging them down for too long. What we do is that we offer a helping hand. Go ahead.
You've told us that simple treatment is often ineffective, but on our side, we...
Okay. Moving on to the second question of this debate, and that is, why will more people do drugs on the side of Opposition? We brought you 4 structural reasons for why that is, and only one of them was contended by Proposition. That was the one of risk factors. And notice that they have a large contradiction in their case here, because they say that the reason why most people do not do drugs in the status quo is because they fear that they are too dangerous. On the other hand, then they tell us that the drugs in their areas would be supremely safe, they would be quality tested. Therefore, we believe that, for example, vulnerable groups like adolescents would be more likely, when these risk factors are taken away, to start doing these drugs. But it is not all that we talked about. We talked about how new communities would form. Notice the nuance of this argument, because we tell you that it is not like the old established communities would disappear. What Proposition does is that they would only form new ones. So they do not relocate the crime, they only multiply it. Moreover, we talked about prescription medications. Why, when you're in this area, you're actively incentivized by the dealers to scale up on your drug use. And this crucially undercuts their case, and the lack of reaction loses them this debate. Towards the third question here about helping the most vulnerable individuals. And notice the nuance in our case here, because we tell you that on the one hand, you have the people who are either not drug users in the status quo, or who are not in these established drug communities. Those are the people who would scale up their drug use. But then you have those who are extreme drug addicts who would not even go to these parks. And we believe that these are the most vulnerable groups in this debate. And then again, we brought you 5 structural reasons for why they would not go to these parks. None of them was redacted in the second speech. And we tell you that these are most vulnerable because they're closest to death, deep in their addiction, and most in need of help. we tell you that what we provide to them is our trained professional outreach groups, which have already proven to work in many European countries. And what they do is that they go into these communities, they interact with these people on a peer-to-peer basis. Therefore, they're able to individually pull them out of these communities and guide them to treatment centers. Secondly, why we uniquely reach them, what Proposition cannot get, is the point about cautioning, because we don't just throw them in jail how Proposition would do when they find them on the street. No, we guide them into these treatment centers again. For those reasons, we believe that they don't help the most vulnerable in this debate, which is why we already take the debate, because those are also the people who are the most likely to, for example, commit crime. Therefore, that also undercuts the points and arguments brought up by Proposition. On to my extension about social perception of addicts. We bring you crucially 2 points here. We firstly tell you that what Proposition creates is a label of otherness, because the state will actively be telling the society that these people are unfit to live amongst other people. They round them up and lock them in these areas. We tell you that the impact will be that drug addicts will be perceived as dangerous. Therefore, it will be harder for them to find jobs, find friends, and crucially reintegrate back into the society. The second point here is that Proposition loses political capital for long-term upkeep of their program. This is because the media coverage will be very different on the two sides of the house. How so? Because on our side of the house, there is a case of a drug overdose and it gets printed in the media. It is blamed on the drugs, like drugs are seen as the problem. On side of Proposition, it will be the institutions on whom the blame will be pinned. Therefore, we feel that in the long term, the support for these programs and these areas will decrease. For those reasons, because there will be less drug addicts on our side of the house, there will be less crime, we help the most vulnerable people, we beg you to oppose.
Okay, the other judges also ready? Then I would like to welcome the third speaker of Team Proposition.
Okay, can you all hear me? If I speak like this, is this fine? Okay, and I would prefer POIs to be giving like on a sheet of paper so I can see them. If that's fine with everyone. Cool. Okay, I'll just start. Good night. Team Opposition was very much in love with their own stance, but there are two main reasons as to why that stance cannot win them today's debate. Because they want to give more money to treatment centers. So the reason they cannot win this is because, number one, more resources and more treatment and more harm reduction tools are not unique to their side. We told you already in our model why we can have that on our side. We don't think that wins them the debate. Secondly, it's because it doesn't address the most vulnerable actors who will still be addicted on either side of the house for the structural reasons that we gave to you, the structural reasons that they never engage with. And therefore, I'm so proud to be standing on side Proposition today. In my speech, I'm going to be looking at two main themes. Firstly, on the individual addicts and how we best help them. And secondly, taking a look at the theme of crime and how it impacts communities in general. Okay, first theme on individual addicts. First issue under this theme is, will these people actually go to the areas? Now, we heard a number of responses to our model and why they would never really go to that areas, where they tried to take our point down on that alone. Now, then they told you that, oh, we already prevent people with a criminal record, and they wanted to talk about aid, how they have a distrust of police, all these ideas with established communities, and how a dealer will manipulate. We have 6 main responses. Firstly, we say that they largely misunderstood our model. We didn't tell you in any any case that we were going to stop people with criminal records from going there. We said we would arrest people if there was a warrant out for them for violent crimes, for instance. We don't think that's illegitimate of us to say. Secondly, we say that the distrust of police in addicts is typically because they are afraid of getting arrested, afraid of losing their drugs and going to prison. Given that in these areas they cannot do that, that distrust goes away. Thirdly, we say that dealers are not able to manipulate people when there's another option. If you as an addict have another option, another place to go to get your drugs, that dealer loses control over you. Because in the status quo, if we look at the comparative, we say that dealers are typically the worst kinds of dealers, the most powerful kinds of dealers, are typically associated with gangs who fight really violent turf wars, no thank you, not at this moment, to ensure that they have a monopoly in certain neighborhoods, and that is what gives them the ability to manipulate. Fourthly, let's just look at the incentives of people. We said that despite their addiction, they still want to be as safe as possible. Just look at the status quo. That's why we see people going to safe injection sites in the first place, because they want to ensure their safety as much as possible. And given that we can actually ensure the safety of these people, we say that they have more of an incentive to go, even if it is it's further away than just the neighborhood playground or whatever. Thirdly, we say that we would already have them be pretty close to the epicenters of bad drug epidemics. We don't see how they can talk about that, especially given that the massive benefits that there are will most likely going to be existing on either side of the house. I'll take you in a second. And lastly, we say that even if we say that there are some people who won't make it, we say that there will still be some people who make it. We say that they're comparatively better because given the support initiatives from the status quo, this comparative alone wins us the debate. Because if we can prove that that a large majority of people are actually going to get out of these, going to get to these places and have access to this, going to not get arrested, not get their lives ruined for having drugs, and actually having a better chance, we say that we on this comparative alone win the debate. Before I'm going on to the next issue, I'll take your point.
Please address the tension in your case, that on the one hand you tell us how cool and awesome and easy it would be to go to these areas, and then tell us that not more people will opt into using drugs or scale up the drug use.
Okay, that is actually really convenient because that is the next issue, asking whether there will be more addicts. We already told you how the ground addicts, so the regular number of addicts, of people who are typically addicted to the hardest drugs, are going to be addicted on either side. Now, what did they tell you? They talked to you about how legality discourages, and when you have more access, double more access. We have a number of responses here. Firstly, we say that that is a contradiction on their side. That is a contradiction on their side if they want to talk about how they're not going to put you in jail, they're not going to give you a certain punishment for that. So they cannot uphold the idea that because it's more legal, then it will not be a problem. If they want to ensure that there's not the same punishment, they will have to bite the harm of legality not being a determining factor. Secondly, Mia already told you how legality and accessibility is not a determining factor when someone chooses to do drugs. Because the reason a lot of people are discouraged by drugs and not taking them is because they know the inherent danger of doing hard drugs, especially such as heroin. And we say that that is enough of a deterrent to stop them on their side. Here they accuse us of being contradictory because we said that people will know that something is dangerous while we are still making it safer. Note here, we never said that we would say that, oh, this is the completely safe thing. We would say that drugs are dangerous, but the least the government can do for the most vulnerable people in society is to ensure that they can take these dangerous drugs in the safest way possible. Furthermore, we told you that access is inherently, no thank you, not a problem. We already explained to you how rich people can essentially get drugs without any problems, without any repercussions. Never heard a response to that. And we already told you how a lot of poor communities are epicenters for selling drugs. Furthermore, they wanted to talk about how these people create communities and then they'll just bounce off each other and make bad behavior. Firstly, we say that we don't think that these addicts will want to create a lot of communities in there because a lot of them are extremely ashamed of their addiction. A lot of them only go there to get their drugs, shoot their heroin, and get out. We don't think that that's going to help. Furthermore, the idea of prescription medication and then having these places to encourage them and tempt them essentially is a false argument because when they talk about this happens after these people got addicted, meaning that they don't remove the structural reasons for why people do drugs. And at their best, on the harms of drug dealers who approach people and make them take harder drugs, we say that their harms are symmetrical. They have given you no mechanisms to stop harmful practice among drug dealers, so we don't think they can take that claim. Secondly, we say that our side is actually better because of our third point, and the comparative is far worse, because with unchecked drug dealers, which they would have on their side of the house, that is where they lace your drugs with fentanyl to ensure you get hooked instantly. That is where they can coerce you and assault you and violate you, which we also heard no response to, and on that alone we win. But even if there are marginally more people, we said that it's principally better to help the most vulnerable people, that are not addressed in the status quo, that the state has categorically let down. They have never engaged with that principle either. We win on this theme. Then lastly, on the idea of crime and communities. Firstly, we told you how it benefits communities because these poor communities already have rampant drug use, and the only real response we heard was that, we'll be making it easier to get drugs, which is generally uncomparative given that it's very easy to get drugs in these communities in the first place. Then they told you about the political backlash and that locals will get angry. But the most pressing problems in these communities is the prevalence of drugs, and given that we confine them to a specific area, we say that we're actually going to be seen as a positive thing because that is what's going to attract the investments that they so very much want. Then we furthermore talk to you about how we better outcrowd dealers. Now, the only response here we heard was that they will fight the state and there'll just be violence. So we say that at their best, we say that it's in the interest of these gangs to be as legal as possible. Then lastly, they wanted to talk about the social perception. I think that was a really weird and underdeveloped point, but let's just deal with it furthermore. The label of being an other already exists in the status quo, especially with it being criminalized. You're typically seen as a dirty criminal. They cannot have that on their other side. And the idea of the media coverage being different, they gave no mechanisms for it. So because we're the ones who actively protect the individuals, because we're the ones better in communities, pushing out bad drug dealers, we are proud to win this debate on Proposition.
Okay, the other judges ready as well? Yeah, you are.
Okay, perfect. Just because of the fact that they dropped their split argument in their third speech, we believe that you can clearly see that their argumentation about gang violence is not standing in today's debate. Two things in my speech. First, I will tell you why on the side of Proposition, you will have higher amount of drug users. Second, I will tell you why under our side of the house, we have much better treatment. But before that, let's take a look at some strategic mistakes made by side of Proposition in today's debate. First, there is this contradiction around how they deem that people don't use drugs because they're dangerous, and then they're creating like more safe space for drugs in general. So here we believe they're contradicting themselves in their approach towards drugs. Secondly, it's the lack of reaction we had from their side, especially concerning our 5 reasons why people won't use these areas and why people won't go into those non-residential areas. One reaction we got was about like this police, that because you will not get punished for like going to these areas, you will not care about the presence of police, but it's the general bad feeling you get from the police presence because you have this experience before. So we believe that just because of the fact there are 4 other reasons, no thank you, we believe that people will have incentives not to use these areas, and therefore much of their argumentation is fallen because all the arguments were contingent on the idea that those areas will be used. Because also, for example, the treatment centers are only present in those areas, and therefore when people won't go there, no treatment is possible. And finally, just this idea how much content was dropped throughout their speech. They did not develop anyhow and did not react on our reactions to their split argument about gangs, how these gangs will be more violent and will create more pressure around these communities. We believe that these communities they want to protect will be more harmed under their side. But now let's take a look at the 2 clashes in today's debate. First, yes, go ahead.
Please recognize that at the worst, these communities are already plagued by gang violence in the status quo that you support. How will you address that on your side of the house?
Thank you. So first, we believe that even if we take you on the highest ground and say that, we have it like same in the status quo, we believe that you even make it worse because of the fact that you cannot have like all the capital for protecting those communities, firstly, and secondly, because those gangs have the motivation to fight against the state, to fight against those communities, and to have still the influence. But still, if your argumentation about like gangs is contingent on the fact that you have amount of drug users, because you scale up the amount of drug users, we believe that we still take this argument. So now let's take a look at first flash. This was basically our first argument. This was largely neglected by side of proposition. We told you here that first in the status quo, you have certain risk factors. That means that a majority of people decide not to use drugs. And one of those factors may be the reality that using drugs is dangerous. But other factors are the fact that those drugs are illegal and those drugs are inaccessible. And those two factors are the ones that are mitigated by side of propositions. Therefore, they're creating more incentive for people to try drugs. For example, when they want to experiment with drugs. But we also give a unique stakeholder in today's debate, meaning about the prescription medication users. These are people who are already somehow addicted, and now they have the opportunity to solve their problem easily by going to these areas. There was no reaction whatsoever, and we believe just because of the fact that these are also vulnerable people, we should protect. We are much more better in the protection as such. And finally, we told you that they're creating extra communities. They don't lower the amount, but rather create extra communities apart from the already established communities that will rather not go to the parties because they're already in the safe place they have. But because of those extra communities that will be in the park, the amount of drug users will only scale up. Severity of drug addictions will be much worse. But now let's take a look at the next question of today's debate, being the treatment. So which side of the house has better and more effective treatment, and therefore which side of the house has better results concerning those drug addicts? And here we believe it is crucial because also they themselves said that those drug addicts are the ones that they want to protect the most because they're the victims that we need to care for. So there are 4 steps of the treatment we want to undertake. First step is just this idea of being informed about the treatment. And here they told you that we are not somehow exclusive. But the point is that we took this localized approach. We have those NGOs that are going to those communities that are finding out actively the spots in which the drugs are taken. No, thank you. And therefore, those people will get the information about the possibility of taking up treatment. Note that the side of proposition is not reaching these people at all, therefore not giving these people any chance whatsoever to undergo the treatment as they don't have the information necessary. But even if we say that the side of proposition has informed community of drug dealers, we say that they're failing in the second step, and that's the decision to undergo the treatment, because they're creating the stigma around these people. This was our split argument, also not really reacted to the core of the argument, how they're labeling these people, that these are the people who we should rather ostracize from the society, how we should rather avoid them because they're somehow dangerous and not normal. We believe that because of this existent stigma around these people, these drug users won't decide to undergo the treatment because they don't want to be member of this society that rejects their presence. No, thank you. And secondly, because of this idea that they create like this safe drugs, safe haven, like for drugs, safe non-residential areas, we believe that they're demotivating these individuals to undergo the treatment, and therefore this decision is less likely under the side of proposition. But even if we say that these people will decide to undergo the treatment, we believe that in the third step in the treatment, that it is necessary to start and continue with the treatment, they are failing the worst. No, thank you. And these are 2 ways. First, we told you that we have more treatment of higher quality, and secondly, we have better environment for treatment. Note that they did not really respond to any of this analysis given to you in our second speech. First, about the quality, we told you that there is inherent opportunity cost under their side of the house, because when they have this like limited budget of money that goes on this like drug
policy, we say that when we take this money, instead of putting them to those non-residential areas, we put them to those treatment centers. We're much more effective in creating better treatment overall. We're much more likely to be successful in the treatment. But second factor here is the environment. And note that this is also crucial, because when you want to fight addiction, you need to also work with your mental state. And when you have constant mental association with the place where you once took the drug, and it is the same place where now you have to treat yourself from the drugs, because of this always present temptations and cues from the environment, you're less likely to be successful in this treatment just because of this mentality behind it. But finally, even if we say that under their side of the house, some people will undergo the treatment, we tell you that for them it is very difficult to integrate back to the society, because they create much more stigma around these individuals, because they say that those are the individuals that should be reallocated from the society. Because we're the side that has less amount of drug users, because we provide better treatment, you should vote opposition. Thank you.
Okay, please welcome now the reply speaker of Team Opposition to close their case.
First, just a quick audio check. Everything fine? All right. So, 3, 2, 1. The saddest sight one can encounter is a drug addict on the ground, a mere shell of what he once was, former self. On prop, he would be confined to his established community without a hope to ever recover, relapsing after every try. What we offer is a helping hand. 2 things I'll do in my speech. First, I'll talk about crime. Second, I'll talk about the quantity and magnitude of drug users. So firstly, crime, right? First thing to note here is that side proposition completely dropped their own split about gang violence, right? Not only because we already refuted in the first speech, right? But also because they acknowledge that the fact that gangs are already violent when they fight because of the drug market between each other, they would probably be violent and fight against the state as well, right? This is very important because this is closely related to their own argument about poor communities, right? Because what they say here is that communities that already have limited funds and that already are underinvested into have the capacity to police these areas properly and to fight against gangs, right? So the fact that we have already tackled this split is also indirectly related to our responses to their argument about poor communities. And this was even more exacerbated by the split argument of my second speaker, because he told you about why there will be limited amount of political capital. He told you why this project will not be sustainable in the long run, and this is especially true for the poor communities that side proposition wants to protect the most. But let's take a look at the second issue of this debate, and that was the quantity of drug users, right? So the first thing to note is the comparative of treatment centers under both sides, because we told you 4 things, or 4 harms of treatment centers under side proposition. Firstly, they lack finances, because this motion assumes a limited amount of finance, right? And they can say, oh, we'll pay for everything, right? Comparatively, if they have to pay for the areas, and that is something that Victor said, we should have more money to invest into the center. Secondly, we talked about the effect of the areas on the treatment itself, right? The fact that when you go through the area and see the availability of drugs makes you more likely to relapse. The fact that you have your own social group in the area, making it more harder for you to break out of the cycle and giving you an easy way out. But the third thing that Victor told you was about political capital, right? The fact that since it is hard to garner political capital as a politician to sustainably manage these areas means that the treatment centers will be underfunded. But lastly, and perhaps most importantly, we talked about stigma. Why it's so hard to reintegrate into society, even after you pass through the treatment center under side proposition. And note that all of this was contingent on them actually showing that the most vulnerable people will flock to these areas, which they didn't. We provided you 5 structural reasons, and they still haven't said how they want to manage this policy in big cities like Tokyo or New York, right? They have huge gaps in this which they have not yet resolved, and it's too late right now. Because we, on the other hand, reach out to them directly, invest into NGOs, and we take a localized approach, we are comparatively more likely to be able to reach the communities that need this help the most, right? But then note that this is not all, because the last thing here is that side proposition actively creates new drug users and encourages them to scale up their drug use. We gave you 4 reasons in our first argument, and the one thing that they did when reacting was contradicting themselves when they were talking about risk factors, because they said, oh no, it's because drugs are dangerous, and that's why they are afraid of them, so we make them safe and pure, right? They have only undermined themselves with that. So not only do they have bad treatment centers, not only do they exacerbate crime, but they also actively encourage the scaling up of drug use. And that is why your ballot should go to side opposition.
Okay, so thank you for your speech. Please now welcome the reply speaker of Team Proposition to close their case.
I'd like to start out this speech by painting a picture of what the 2 walls in this debate looks like. On proposition, we're going to designate specific areas that are going to be close to the 2 areas with a high number of drug dealers in the status quo. A place away from kindergartens, place away from schools. When addicts come here, they'll be seen to by social workers. They'll be able to check what's in their drugs. They'll be able to engage in this trade without getting caught up in other forms of crime and without getting arrested for it. On opposition, they stood for a role of decriminalization, where they would provide people with safe injection sites, but people are less likely to go. People will still have to interact with the black market, putting themselves in danger of violence and of coercion, and where communities still will cripple under gang violence of children stepping on needles on their way from home from school. Their own utopian characterization was out of touch with reality. But either way, they failed to provide any semblance of the hand up, the handout, the light at the end of the tunnel on our side of the house, so proud to still be proposing. With that, 2 questions in today's debate. Firstly, what side better protects victims of drug addiction? And secondly, what side lower crimes and help communities the most? So firstly, on the theme of victims of drug addiction, what they told us here, first of all, is that we're going to have more drug users on our side of the house. But I think they contradicted themselves in a number of ways. They told us that people don't use drugs because it's illegal in the status quo. But at the same time, they told us that they wanted to decriminalize it on their side of the house. They told us that people don't do drugs because they're inaccessible, without realizing that they were the side of drug sale in every street corner in poor communities and that wanted injection sites all around towns. They told us that people won't go into these areas, but at the same time that they would attract so many new abusers. We told you that the reason why people don't do drugs is because they know that it's dangerous. But the reason that they do are structural reasons that are a direct result of state failure and which won't change on either side of the house. They then told us about how they're going to be better safety on their side of the house in their safe injection sites. But we think that the benefits of these safe injection sites are largely the same that we're going to see in these areas on our side of the house. So the question then becomes, where are people more likely to go? We told you that there are incentives that are specific to our side of the house, such as people not wanting to get arrested, such as people wanting a specific place where they don't have to interact with the black market. That means people will go to these areas on our side of the house. They only asserted that people would go to these safe injection sites on their side. We think we definitely took the theme of helping victims of drug abuse. But what side then lower crimes and help communities the most? What they told us here is that it's unfair to use money on this instead of directly on the communities. But at the same time, I think they were a bit contradictory again, because they're likely going to use largely the same amount of money on their side on these safe injection sites that they want to provide. But we also told you that we're the side that are exactly doing the kind of things that help these communities and that means less resentment towards drug addicts in general. We told you that on their side, the black market would be spread out and drug addicts would be seen on every street throughout the areas. So on our side of the house, we're able to put these drug addicts in one specific place that can be close to, but not in the middle of these communities where people are likely. So we're likely to see less needles on the ground, less drug addicts in the street. We told you that on our side of the house, the black market will disappear, which means less powerful gangs, which are the ones who uniquely cannot enter these zones because of their past criminal behavior. We told you that this means reducing gang violence, reducing turf wars. Those are unique benefits that they don't get on their side of the house and which are incredibly important in this debate. But regardless of whether or not you buy any of our early analysis, at the point at where the state is complicit in forcing people into drug addiction and into drug dealing through pernicious action and blind inaction, it is principally unjust to punish them, and this principle has stood throughout the round. We provide a hand up, a handout, a light at the end of the tunnel. So proud to have taken this debate.
Okay, so thank you very much for this round. It was a very interesting round. What I will do now is send the message to the organizers that they will get us judges out of here.
Thank you so much. Debate, guys.